It was a warm afternoon when Lisa decided to run a few errands. The sun shone brightly as she drove through the busy streets, her mind focused on the simple tasks ahead. She was looking forward to finishing everything quickly so she could get home and relax. Lisa was a hard-working woman, a mother and a wife, living a peaceful life in the city with her family. She had everything she needed, and though life wasn't perfect, she was content. As she drove down a familiar road, she noticed a police car parked on the side. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police officers were part of the city landscape. But as she continued driving, she noticed the cop stepping into the street, signaling for her to pull over. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She had done nothing wrong, but still, she felt the familiar tension people often feel when they are stopped by the police. Her palms grew sweaty as she carefully pulled her car to the side of the road and put it in park. The officer, a tall man with a serious face, approached her window. He didn't smile or give any sort of greeting. "License and registration," he said gruffly, his voice cold. Lisa, surprised by his lack of politeness, nodded and handed over her documents. As the officer took the papers, Lisa noticed something in his eyes, something that made her uneasy. It wasn't just routine. There was an edge to his demeanor. He looked at her for a moment before returning his gaze to the documents, almost as if inspecting her, as though she had done something wrong before even speaking to him. "Do you know why I stopped you?" the officer asked, his tone sharp. Lisa, trying to stay calm, shook her head. "No, officer, I don't." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around as if weighing something in his mind. Then he spoke again, his voice now even more direct and almost accusing. "You were speeding back there." Lisa's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. I didn't think I was going over the limit." The officer paused for a second, looking at her closely. "Well, you were," he said with a slight sneer. Even though there was no radar gun or clear evidence, the accusation felt unfair, but Lisa kept her calm. She didn't want to escalate the situation. She nodded politely, but before she could say anything else, the officer reached for something at his side. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Lisa was taken aback. "What? Is this necessary?" His expression remained stone cold. "Step out of the car." Lisa's heart began to race. She had no idea what was going on or why the situation was escalating like this. She glanced around at the quiet street, noticing that there were no other cars, and the air was thick with tension. She took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped out. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, trying to stay calm. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to her, as if getting into her personal space. Lisa felt a sense of discomfort. She wasn't sure why, but something about this man made her feel small, like he was enjoying the power he held in this moment. Then, in one quick motion, the officer raised his leg and kicked Lisa sharply in the back. The force knocked her off balance, and she stumbled forward, nearly falling onto the sidewalk. Shock flooded her body as she tried to steady herself. Her heart pounded, her thoughts racing. What just happened? She wondered, in disbelief at the pain and confusion rushing through her. Her body tingled with the sharp sting of the kick, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she stood up straight, taking a deep breath. She knew she couldn't let him see her break. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. And so, Lisa, still feeling the heat of the officer's unjust behavior, took a slow step back. The encounter had just begun, and she had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Lisa stood there, stunned by the officer's sudden action. The pain in her back throbbed, but the worst part was the shock. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her mind was racing. Why did he do that? What had she done to deserve this? She glanced around, but the street was still quiet, and no one had stepped forward to help or speak up. It felt like the world had frozen for a moment, and she was left alone to deal with it. The officer, seemingly unfazed by the hurtful act, took a step back and looked at her, his eyes cold and uninterested. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to collect herself. She couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not in front of him. She slowly straightened her back, brushing herself off, and stood tall. Despite the sting in her body, she refused to let him see that he had shaken her. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice more steady than she felt. The officer didn't reply immediately. He just stared at her for a few moments, as if sizing her up. It was almost as if he enjoyed having control over the situation. Lisa, feeling the humiliation wash over her, clenched her fists. She wasn't going to let this man break her. "Get back in your car," the officer finally ordered, his voice flat, but firm. Lisa hesitated. She wasn't sure if she should obey him. It felt wrong. The way he had kicked her, it was uncalled for. But she didn't want to escalate things further. She knew that there was a chance this situation could get worse if she argued. She didn't know if anyone would come to help her if things turned even more violent. So with a slow nod, she turned around and walked back to her car. She felt the officer's eyes on her as she climbed into the driver's seat. The door clicked shut behind her, and she sat there for a few moments, still in shock. Her body was still trembling, and her thoughts were a blur. What was happening? Was this really happening to her? How could this man treat her like this? As Lisa sat in the car, trying to steady her breathing, she realized something. She needed to make a call. She needed to tell her husband what had happened. He was in the military, strong and protective. He would understand, and maybe, just maybe, he could help her make sense of this chaos. Without thinking twice, she pulled out her phone and dialed his number. As the phone rang, she looked up at the officer standing a few feet away, still watching her. She couldn't tell if he was waiting for her to do something or if he was just watching, enjoying the power he had over her. When the phone clicked and her husband's voice came through, it was like a wave of comfort rushed over her. She could hear the concern in his voice as soon as he answered. "Lisa, what's wrong?" "I was stopped by a cop," Lisa said, trying to hold back tears, her voice cracking. "He kicked me. He kicked me. And I don't understand why. It hurt. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Lisa could feel her husband's anger building. He wasn't one to take threats lightly, especially when they involved his family. But more than that, he was protective, and hearing that his wife had been harmed by someone who was supposed to protect others filled him with a sense of duty. "I'm coming," he said firmly. "I'll be there soon." The call ended, and Lisa sat there, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The pain in her back had started to fade, but the shock and anger were still fresh. What was going to happen next? She didn't know, but she knew her husband was on his way. And he wasn't going to let this slide. Lisa sat in the car, her mind spinning. Her body still ached from the shock of the officer's kick, but it wasn't the pain that bothered her the most. It was the feeling of helplessness. How could this have happened to her? She had done nothing wrong. She had always respected the law, always done her best to stay out of trouble. Yet here she was, sitting in her car, shaken by an officer who was supposed to protect people like her. She glanced out of the window, trying to find something that would bring her back to reality. The street was still quiet, with only a few cars passing by. No one had stopped to help, and there was no one around who seemed to care about what had just happened. Lisa felt small in that moment. She had never imagined a day like this would come. Taking a deep breath, she reached for her phone again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed her husband's number, hoping that hearing his voice would bring some comfort. She waited as the phone rang, the seconds feeling like an eternity. Finally, he picked up. "Lisa, what happened? Are you okay?" Her husband's voice came through with concern and urgency. "I'm not sure," Lisa replied, trying to sound calm. "I'm fine, but I don't know. I was stopped by a cop. He said I was speeding, but I wasn't. Then he kicked me. Right there on the street. I didn't know what to do." Her voice cracked slightly, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes. The anger she had been holding back for so long began to rise. It wasn't just the kick. It was the humiliation, the unfairness of it all. She had been trying so hard to stay calm, but it was getting harder. Her husband's response was swift and full of emotion. "That's unacceptable. I'll be there soon. Don't worry. I'm coming. Stay in the car and stay calm." Lisa nodded, though he couldn't see her. His words were a comfort, but the helplessness she felt was still there. The officer had done something unforgivable, and the worst part was that she was alone. She wanted to feel safe, but instead, she felt vulnerable and exposed. She glanced out of the window again, looking for any sign of the officer's intentions. He was still standing near his patrol car, not moving. The silence in the air was thick, and Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Lisa's heart raced as she waited for her husband to arrive. She wasn't sure what would happen when he got there, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't something she could just forget. It wasn't just about the pain from the kick. It was about the power the officer had taken from her in that moment. It was about how she felt, as if the whole system was against her, and she was powerless to do anything about it. Her thoughts were interrupted when she saw headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded her, and she knew it was her husband. He was here, and no matter what happened next, she wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to be a silent victim. As her husband's car pulled up beside hers, Lisa felt a mixture of emotions: relief, anger, and a deep sense of protection. She knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Lisa's hand shook as she held the phone, waiting for her husband to answer. The minutes felt like hours. She couldn't stop thinking about the officer's face, the way he looked at her as if she didn't matter. But more than that, she couldn't stop the thoughts racing in her mind. Was this just a random act? Was it something deeper, something bigger than just one officer's bad day? Her heart pounded as the phone rang, the sound echoing in her ears. She had to tell her husband what happened. She needed him to know the truth, to understand the depth of what she was feeling. She needed to hear his voice, to feel his calm presence, even if he was miles away. He always knew how to handle situations like this. She just hoped he would be able to make everything better. After what felt like an eternity, the phone finally clicked. "Lisa, what happened? Are you okay?" Her husband's voice was a mix of concern and urgency. Hearing it made Lisa's chest tighten with relief. She wasn't alone anymore. He was there for her, even if he wasn't physically with her. I'm not sure. I'm okay, but I don't know how to explain this." Her voice trembled as she tried to put the words together. She could feel the lump in her throat, but she forced herself to keep it together. "I was stopped by a cop. He said I was speeding, but I wasn't. Then he kicked me, right in the back." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Lisa's heart sank as she imagined her husband's reaction. Would he be angry? Would he be disappointed? He was a soldier, used to handling situations with strength and precision. But this was different. This was something he couldn't control from a distance. "What? He kicked you?" her husband finally said, his voice tight with disbelief. That's unbelievable. I'm coming. Stay there. Don't leave the car. I'll be there soon." Lisa felt a flood of emotions. The relief from hearing his voice, the anger bubbling up again at what had happened, and the fear of not knowing what would come next. She wanted to tell him to take his time, to be careful, but she knew he wouldn't. When it came to his family, her husband didn't back down. He had always been her protector, always the one who kept her safe. But now, she felt like the world was crashing down around her. "I'm scared," Lisa admitted quietly, her voice barely a whisper. She had never felt so vulnerable before, so exposed. "I don't know what to do." Her husband's response was firm, yet soothing. "Don't worry. I'm on my way. You're not alone in this. We'll take care of it, Lisa. Just stay calm. I'll be there before you know it." His words were like a lifeline. pulling her out of the storm of emotions she had been drowning in. She knew he wasn't just saying words to comfort her. He meant it. He always did. He was a man of action, and when he said he would take care of something, he did. The call ended, and Lisa sat in the car, still shaken but feeling a little stronger. She had told him everything, and now, all she had to do was wait. It wasn't going to be easy. The officer had crossed a line, and Lisa knew her husband wouldn't let that slide. But she also knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. She wasn't going to back down either. As she sat in the car, the sounds of the world outside seemed distant, muffled by the pounding in her head. But one thing was clear: this wasn't over. And when her husband arrived, the officer would have to answer for what he had done. When Lisa hung up the phone, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. Her husband, Marcus, had always been her rock. He wasn't just strong in body, but in spirit too. She knew he would handle this, but the unknown still lingered in her mind. What would happen when he arrived? Would the officer escalate things even further? And what if the situation spiraled out of control? But deep down, Lisa also knew something. Marcus was not someone who let injustice slide. He had always been fiercely protective of his family. And now, he would do everything in his power to make sure what happened to her would not go unnoticed. As the minutes ticked by, Lisa glanced around at the empty street, trying to calm herself. She could still feel the officer's cold gaze, and the memory of the kick echoed in her body. But as the seconds passed, she reminded herself that she wasn't alone anymore. Marcus was on his way. Soon, the officer would have to answer for what he did. Back at home, Marcus was already in action. When he had heard about what had happened, the anger in his voice was unmistakable. But there was also something else there: calm determination. He didn't rush into decisions without thinking them through, and this was no different. His military training had taught him to assess situations, remain level-headed, and take action when necessary. He knew that Lisa needed him, and that thought alone pushed him to move faster. The drive to the scene felt like an eternity, but Marcus kept his focus on one thing: getting to his wife. He could picture her sitting in the car, still shaken by the officer's actions. His heart ached, but he knew he couldn't waste time feeling helpless. Marcus thought about how Lisa had always been the one to keep their family grounded. She was the calm in the storm, the person who always kept a clear head. But he knew that what she had just experienced was enough to shake anyone to their core. He couldn't let that go. He had to make sure that she felt safe again. As he neared the location, he felt his emotions rising. His protective instinct was stronger than ever, but he also knew that reacting out of pure anger would not help. He needed to stay focused. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure this didn't happen again. It was about standing up for what was right. As Marcus parked his car a few blocks away from the scene, he took a deep breath. His mind was sharp, his body ready. The military had taught him how to stay calm in the most intense situations. But this was different. This wasn't a mission or an operation. This was his wife. He knew that going straight to the officer might be risky, but he wasn't going to let the officer get away with what he had done. He had to make his presence known, show the officer that his actions would not be ignored. But he also had to do it in a way that would keep Lisa safe. He wasn't going to make things worse. With his mind made up, Marcus stepped out of the car and walked towards the scene. His steps were firm and deliberate, but there was no rushing. He knew exactly what he needed to do. The moment he saw the officer standing by his patrol car, he felt a surge of resolve. Lisa would be okay. Marcus would make sure of it. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken as he walked down the quiet street. His mind was focused, sharp, and clear. He wasn't one to rush into things without thinking, especially after everything that had happened. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but the anger he felt bubbling inside was hard to ignore. All he wanted right now was to make sure Lisa was safe and to make sure the officer paid for what he had done. As Marcus approached the officer's patrol car, he could see the man standing beside it. his posture rigid. The officer looked up as Marcus got closer, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was no fear in Marcus's gaze, only determination. He wasn't going to let this man get away with his actions. The officer glanced at Marcus, his eyes narrowing. "Can I help you, sir?" His tone was cold, as if he didn't recognize the tension in the air. Marcus didn't waste any time. "You can start by explaining why you kicked my wife." The officer looked surprised at first, but then his face hardened. "What are you talking about? She was speeding, and I gave her a warning." "I don't care about your warning," Marcus said firmly, his voice steady but full of authority. "You had no reason to touch her. You had no right to kick her." The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "She's overreacting. It was just a push. She's fine." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had to stay in control, no matter how much he wanted to lash out. "You don't get to decide how my wife feels, and you don't get to put your hands on her." For a moment, there was silence between them. The officer didn't say anything, but the tension was thick in the air. Marcus could feel his heart beating in his chest, and he knew this conversation was about to escalate, but he had no intention of backing down. Not now. "You need to understand something," Marcus said, his voice low but serious. "What you did was wrong, and I'm not leaving until you understand that." The officer's eyes flickered with something, maybe annoyance, or maybe fear, but he didn't back away. Instead, he took a step closer to Marcus. "You better watch how you speak to me," the officer warned, trying to assert some authority. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You hurt my wife, and now you'll answer for it. This isn't over." The officer's expression shifted, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might escalate things even further. But instead, the officer seemed to take a step back, his chest rising and falling as if he was weighing his options. Marcus could see that the officer was realizing that this wasn't just a routine stop. This was something bigger, something he hadn't expected. "I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing," Marcus continued. "You can apologize to my wife, or you can face the consequences of your actions." The officer was quiet for a long time, and Marcus could see the struggle behind his eyes. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this go. Not until Lisa was safe. Not until the officer understood that what he had done was wrong. As the tension hung in the air, Marcus stood tall, unwavering. He wasn't going anywhere until he knew that his wife would be treated with the respect she deserved. And if the officer refused to listen, Marcus was prepared to take whatever steps necessary to make sure justice was served. Marcus stood his ground, watching the officer carefully. The tension between them was undeniable, and the air felt thick with unspoken words. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after what had happened to Lisa. He was here to make sure that the officer understood the consequences of his actions, and he wasn't going to leave until the officer realized just how serious this was. The officer seemed to be weighing his options. His eyes darted around, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might walk away or make a quick exit. But instead, the officer took a deep breath, straightened up, and took a step forward. His expression was hard, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't have time for this," the officer said, his voice more tense now than before. But Marcus could tell the officer wasn't as confident as he had been earlier. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Marcus didn't move. He stood tall, his posture firm, but not threatening. "You hurt my wife. That's all that matters right now. You're going to answer for it." The officer looked around again, probably hoping for some backup, but the street remained quiet, with only the sound of distant traffic in the background. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable under Marcus's unwavering gaze. "You don't want to make this a bigger deal than it already is," the officer said, his voice shaky now. Marcus's expression didn't change. "It's already a big deal. You've crossed a line. I'm not leaving here until you understand that." For a moment, the officer didn't speak. He seemed to be processing everything Marcus had said, and there was a brief silence that felt like it stretched on forever. Then, without warning, the officer suddenly turned and walked back toward his patrol car. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Was he about to run? Would he get in his car and drive off, leaving this whole situation unresolved? But instead of getting in his car, the officer paused and turned back to face Marcus. His shoulders sagged, and he looked genuinely defeated. The hard expression that had once been on his face was gone, replaced with something else, something closer to regret. "I'm sorry," the officer said quietly, almost as if the words were forced from his lips. "I shouldn't have done that. I was out of line." Marcus's eyes narrowed as he processed the officer's apology. It wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't the sort of resolution he had imagined when he'd walked up to confront the officer. But in that moment, he knew that something important had shifted. The officer had understood that he had done something wrong, and though it wasn't a perfect outcome, it was a step in the right direction. "You're right," Marcus replied, his voice calm but still firm. "You were out of line, but it's not just about saying sorry. It's about understanding that actions have consequences." The officer nodded, though it was clear that he was still feeling the weight of the situation. "I'll take responsibility for what I did. I know I can't just walk away from it." Marcus didn't say anything more. He simply gave a small nod, signaling that the conversation was over. The officer seemed to understand, and without another word, he returned to his car, the situation finally beginning to calm down. As Marcus watched him drive away, he felt a sense of relief. It wasn't the perfect resolution, but it was the best they were going to get. He turned and walked back toward Lisa, who was still sitting in her car, waiting for him. When he reached her, she looked at him with a mixture of worry and hope in her eyes. "You're safe," Marcus said softly, as he opened the car door and slid inside next to her. "It's over." Lisa smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she took his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, grateful to have him by her side. As Marcus and Lisa sat in the car, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. The officer had apologized, but the damage had already been done. The whole situation had shaken them both, and the streets that once seemed peaceful now felt heavy with unspoken words. Marcus could still feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had acted on instinct, protecting his wife and standing up for what was right. But as the situation settled, he couldn't ignore the reality of the consequences. What had started as an attempt to make sure Lisa was safe now felt like it had spiraled into something bigger. Lisa, too, was silent, her hands still trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She had never imagined a day like this, where her routine would be interrupted by an act of violence. Her body still ached, but it was more than just physical pain. It was the emotional toll of what had happened. She had always been strong, but today had tested her in ways she couldn't have prepared for. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked quietly, turning to her. Lisa nodded, though the expression on her face told a different story. "I don't know. I feel shaken. I didn't expect any of this." Marcus understood. It wasn't just the kick that had affected her. It was the entire experience. It was the humiliation, the fear, the sense that someone had tried to take control over her life without reason. It wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. "I know," Marcus said softly, "but you're safe now. That's all that matters." They both sat in silence for a while, just trying to process everything. The air around them felt heavy, like they were waiting for something else to happen. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The officer may have apologized, but would the story end there? He didn't know. Soon, the quiet was broken by the sound of approaching sirens. The red and blue lights flickered in the distance, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He looked at Lisa, who met his gaze with concern. What was happening now? Were the police coming to investigate? Was there going to be more trouble? The car pulled up beside them, and a new officer stepped out. Marcus's muscles tensed, but he stayed calm. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation any further. "Everything all right here?" the officer asked, his tone neutral but curious. Marcus exchanged a glance with Lisa before replying. "Yes, officer. We're fine." The new officer looked at them for a moment, then nodded. "We got a call about a disturbance. Just making sure everything is okay." Marcus explained what had happened earlier, recounting the incident with the officer who had stopped Lisa. The new officer listened carefully, his face serious but understanding. "I see. I'll take it from here." The officer didn't seem surprised, but there was a subtle shift in the way he looked at Marcus and Lisa. It was like he could sense the tension, the underlying worry that still lingered. He didn't ask any more questions, simply turning to leave. As the new officer got back into his patrol car, Marcus felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The events of the day had taken their toll on both of them. It wasn't just about what had happened on the street. It was the feeling of being caught in something larger, something that neither of them could fully control. "Do you want to go home?" Marcus asked quietly. Lisa nodded, her eyes heavy. "Yes, I just want to go home." As they drove away from the scene, Marcus kept his eyes on the road, the weight of the day still pressing on his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He would always be there to protect Lisa, no matter what. The drive back home was quiet, but not in the way it used to be. There was a tension between Marcus and Lisa, not from anything they had said to each other, but from the weight of everything that had happened. Neither of them had expected the day to unfold like this. What had started as a simple errand had turned into a life-changing event, one they would both carry with them for a long time. Lisa leaned her head back against the headrest, staring out of the window at the passing streetlights. Her thoughts were swirling in her mind. She kept replaying the moment when the officer kicked her, the confusion, the shock, the helplessness she felt in that split second. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the feeling of being treated like she didn't matter, like she wasn't even a person deserving of respect. That was what hurt the most. Marcus, glancing at her, knew exactly what she was feeling. He could see the faraway look in her eyes. He could feel the anger bubbling in his chest again, the protective instinct that had led him to confront the officer earlier. He had done what he thought was necessary to protect his wife. But now, as they drove home, he couldn't help but wonder if the situation had truly been resolved. Was an apology enough? Was it enough for Lisa? "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the silence. Lisa turned to look at him, her eyes softening. She smiled, but it was a tired, uncertain smile. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "I just need time to process everything." Marcus nodded. He understood. They both did. This wasn't something that would just go away. The hurt, the humiliation, the fear, it all lingered, and it would take time to heal. But what mattered most was that they were together. No matter what had happened, they had each other, and that was the only thing that kept Marcus grounded. As they pulled into their driveway, the weight of the day seemed to lift just a little. Home. It felt like the one place where they could begin to put everything behind them, to find some sense of normalcy again. Marcus parked the car and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved right away. The silence was comfortable, but heavy. "I don't know what comes next," Marcus said after a long pause. "But I know one thing. We'll face it together." Lisa turned to him and nodded. "Yeah, together." They sat there for a moment, taking in the quiet of their home. It was hard to imagine that just hours ago they had been in the middle of a nightmare, facing something they never thought they would have to experience. But now, as they sat there, surrounded by the safety of their home, it was clear that they had both survived. They had made it through the worst of it, and while it wouldn't be easy to forget, they had each other to lean on. Marcus reached over and gently took Lisa's hand. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said softly. "We'll heal, and we'll be stronger for it." Lisa squeezed his hand in return. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Together, They stepped out of the car, ready to face whatever the future held. They didn't know what challenges they would encounter next, but they knew they would face them together, stronger, more united than ever before.